Rachel and Nicole will present for about 50 minutes. They've asked for any questions that you might have. They'll address those at the end of their presentation, and we'll wrap up about 10 minutes. Well, the presentation will wrap up, and we'll have time for some questions and answers. About 10 minutes to the hour. About noon, we'll break for lunch, which is from 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock. So here are Rachel and Nicole. Thanks.
Hi, welcome to our session on updating library catalogs with more inclusive subject headings, a planned approach, which should also read from the Marriott Library at the University of Utah. And thank you for joining us today on this first beautiful Friday of fall. So I put a link to the presentation in the chat if you want to follow along or click on any of the links that we have in our presentation, please feel free. So John gave us an introduction, but I'm here with Nicole Lewis, the lead cataloger at the Marriott Library, who works mostly with traditional cataloging and MARC metadata for the library's massive circulating collection. I'm Rachel Wittman, the digital curation librarian at the Marriott Library, and I work mostly with non-MARC metadata for our digital collections. So while Nicole and I both work in different realms of metadata and cataloging, we work a lot with the Library of Congress subject headings. So today, Nicole and I will be representing a larger working group that recently formed at the Marriott Library to tackle offensive subject headings found in our library's catalog, digital library, and special collections finding aids. I'll be taking you through some background on the issue of problematic subject headings, and I'll be touching on the movement's origins, reviewing some current and notable problematic subjects, and then I'll be reviewing some possible solutions to these problematic subject headings. Nicole will then be talking about the strategic directions and values of this working group, the Marriott Library's project and scope, and our planned approach. So spoiler alert, this project is still a work in progress, and we were hoping to be further along for today's presentation, but despite not having a fully implemented project, we thought it would still be valuable to discuss our mission and gather feedback from the ULA community. Hopefully by the annual ULA conference in May, we'll have made more progress in implementing this project, and we'll have more to report back on. And we'd really like to have an open dialogue at the end of our presentation to talk about any questions, similar issues that you've encountered in your work, and if there are any plans or barriers at your library to implementing a similar project. And on that note, I do have we set up a Google document that has some questions for discussion later. And if you're more comfortable writing instead of speaking up, or if you have some audio issues, feel free to add some notes to that document. You should be able to edit it. Okay. So the Library of Congress subject headings is the most widely used controlled vocabulary by library and archives in the United States. I feel a little bit out of my element talking about subject headings to the ULA community, but I'm going to go ahead and do that anyways. Subject headings are used to describe what a work is about, thereby creating user access to an item. These terms are also used to organize materials by topic. These terms are often the gateway and the conduit for users to access materials. They can be some of the first ways in which an information seeker does or does not discover the materials that they're looking for. The Library of Congress subject headings was first published in 1898. And as you can imagine, with the progression of perception and attitudes, especially pertaining to people, women, BIPOC communities, LGBTQ+, and medical conditions, especially neurodiversity, language around these topics has changed dramatically since 1898. And these terms need constant management and revision. Over time, subject terms have changed and progressed to match modern language. One example of a subject term used for African Americans, which throughout most of the 20th century, the heading was Negroes, which changed to in the 1970s to Blacks. Later in 1990s, it was changed to Afro-Americans, and in the early 2000s, it is now the current LCSH term African Americans. So when students or patrons or researchers are using our library catalogs and digital collections, they encounter these terms as they attempt to access sought after information. Terms that offend are often barriers to discovery, but they also create an atmosphere of mistrust between the library and the communities that we serve. But before I go any further, I just want to pay a little bit of homage where homage is due to Sanford Berman. Some of you may have heard of Sanford Sandy Berman before, and he's a historically radical librarian and one of the leading critics of the Library of Congress subject headings. He also was the leading activist for change, especially in terms concerning people. He's the author of a seminal work, which was critical of the Library of Congress subject headings, published in 1971, called Prejudices and Antipathies, a tract of the LC subject headings concerning people. Berman was a leader in the movement to correct biases in subject headings, and he advocated for more common language in these subjects, because that's how people speak and how they retrieve information. There have been a lot of other works out there critical of the Library of Congress subject headings, especially in relation to biases. The Power to Name, Locating the Limits of Subject Representation in Libraries by Hope Olson deserves a shout out, which is a feminist perspective on the Library of Congress subject headings. So to provide an example of one of the most current and popularly debated Library of Congress subject headings is found in the term illegal aliens, which refers to people within a country that do not have legal immigration status. And you may have heard of the battle to change this term to undocumented immigrants, which began in 2014 with a student activist group from Dartmouth College called the Coalition of Immigration Reform and Equality and Dreamers. So these students at Dartmouth College encountered this term in their library's catalog and pushed for the library to change the term. Dartmouth College Library submitted a subject change request due to the dehumanizing language found in this term and requested it be changed to undocumented immigrants. Sadly, the Library of Congress announced it would not change the term since it is a term that's used in legal and official documents. There was a lot of media attention on this. I'm sure most of you have heard about it, and it became very highly politicized. Students and library groups since have petitioned the Library of Congress to change the term, but they have not. And the Library of Congress has proposed adding other terms, including non-citizens and unauthorized immigration, to the Library of Congress subject headings to navigate around illegal aliens. But there have been a lot of pushback from Republican lawmakers that have made multiple attempts to block these subject headings from being added. So it's become a very political debate. If you haven't seen the documentary Change the Subject, I highly recommend it. It's freely available on YouTube to watch. And it basically is a very detailed chronicle of this whole saga of the illegal alien subject heading. And I think one of the most impactful messages from this documentary for librarians was demonstrating how the students at Dartmouth College thought that the library and the librarians were responsible for the offensive term that they encountered in their catalog. They were upset with their librarians. And I think that this is one of the most powerful messages, because we can't expect our library users to know who's in charge of the words that are found in our metadata and catalogs, and understand the worlds of controlled vocabularies and their source. Another quick promotion here, the Marriott Library hosted a panel discussion with the cast of the Change the Subject documentary that has been completely recorded, and you can view it here. It was, this was hosted very recently in May 2021, so it's a very current, up-to-date, discussion on this topic if you're interested. So there's some problem headings there, so some possible solutions to tackle these offensive subject headings. One is to submit a subject change request to the Library of Congress. And this includes filling out a form that includes the new proposed term, and where this proposed term fits in a hierarchy of current terms, citations, and published literature using the proposed term to prove that it's actually a term that's being used. And to the right is it's like a snippet of actually my first and only subject change request that I submitted earlier this year with the help and support of Nicole for the term scrambling, which is an outdoor sport. But you typically have to wait at least a year before you hear anything back with some sort of response or verdict. So others have abandoned trying to change the Library of Congress subject headings one term at a time. Communities who have been negatively impacted by biased terms have created controlled vocabularies to use in conjunction with these LCSH terms. Homosaurus is a linked data controlled vocabulary created by the LGBT+ community, and it is a wonderful example of this. The vocabulary uses terms used by the community, and these are supposed to be used in conjunction with the LCSH as well. Another example is the Wewa Library of First Nations House of Learning vocabulary for Indigenous names, which is in terminology, which is mostly for Canada. I'm sure I'm leaving out other ones here. Feel free to add them in the chat if you know of any. Another solution for libraries is to implement their own local vocabularies and local authority records. And another solution that requires some technology support is changing the term on the user front end while maintaining the LCSH term on the back end of the catalog. I believe this involves some CSS scripts, and you would definitely probably need some technology support to do this. So now Nicole will be talking about some of the ethics of the profession, the University of Utah's values, and more about our working group and our plan moving forward.
Cool, thanks, Rachel. Do you want to go to the next slide? So Rachel's provided an overview of the growing movement towards updating subject headings to more inclusive terminology. Before talking about our project and process, I wanted to highlight the Cataloging Code of Ethics. This is a document that was finalized in January of this year by the Cataloging Ethics Steering Committee. And that group is made up of professionals in the United States, Canada, and the UK. The document underwent a public review period and a couple of revisions. And I'm not going to go into detail about how the steering committee was formed or anything. So if you're interested, I've added the link on this slide to their website. But I wanted to highlight just one small part, which says, we recognize that neither cataloging nor catalogers are neutral, and we endorse critical cataloging as an approach to our shared work with the goal of making metadata inclusive and resources accessible. So what once may have just started with a few catalogers back in Sanford Berman's day is now a sentiment that's, I think, felt more widely across the profession, and that's that we need to make our metadata more inclusive. Next slide. Like many others in the last year and a half, our library dean and directors issued a statement against racism. They state, we will uphold values of diversity, equity, inclusivity, and social justice within our libraries, campus, and community. We are committed to answering the American Library Association's call to action to ensure that racism has no place in our institutions, our policies, our practices, or our behaviors. This statement embodies one of the reasons that we're starting to review our subject headings. Next slide. The other reasons align with our strategic goals and university values. One of our strategic directions is to create a culture of assessment. We regularly assess our work and improve when needed. We also have a commitment to foster diversity and inclusion. In a large academic library like we are, that can be done in many different ways within the library, but for metadata and cataloging, that involves creating inclusion in our descriptive practices. Similarly, one of the core values of the University of Utah is diversity. The U celebrates the rich diversity of people as well as creative and intellectual traditions by being inclusive in every respect. So this kind of forms our, I guess, founding principles that leads us into the project that we are currently doing. Next slide. So our project scope includes the following: subject headings in our library catalog, in the digital library metadata, and in our finding aids. We'd also like to draft a statement about historical language to be posted in each of those locations. What we won't be doing at this point in time is reviewing descriptions in our metadata and finding aids. So like the summaries, anything that's not the subject heading, because the process for finding and correcting harmful language in descriptions will involve quite a bit of a different process. So that will likely take place as a later project. Next slide. We also aren't going to limit ourselves to just one category. In the many diversity presentations that I've attended over the last couple of years, it seems that some libraries focused on just updating illegal aliens because it's been the hot topic. Since implementing changes for any heading would be the same, we're going to look at several different categories, including race and ethnicity, disability or ableism, gender, sexuality, ageism, and any others that we might come across in our research. Next slide. We also want our work to be transparent to our campus community and want to include input generally from our student and faculty groups. We also have several departments on campus that we want to elicit feedback from. These are the American Indian Resource Center, the Black Cultural Center, the Dream Center, the LGBT Resource Center, and the School for Cultural and Social Transformation, which is the campus department which studies a lot of these different social issues. We feel like, you know, our community are the best people to be able to tell us what it is they want to see. And since they're, you know, they are the people that we serve, and getting their input is really important to us. So next slide. So here's a look at our general process and where we're currently at. Like Rachel said, we aren't quite as far along as we had hoped when we submitted this presentation proposal, but we've at least formed a committee, which is a great start. We've also met and discussed our scope, objectives, and deliverables, and we have those in a draft format. We're hoping to meet soon with our library's Diversity and Inclusion Committee and our AD for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So we'll discuss our project goals with them, get some of their feedback, perhaps see if they have any other thoughts on campus groups to elicit feedback from. And then from that point, we'll start reviewing similar projects undertaken at other libraries. We don't really want to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. So looking at what other people have done is, we feel like, will be a good starting point for us, and compiling their decisions regarding headings and alternatives can give us a list to start. And then once we compile all of the headings and their alternatives, we can start going through and adjusting alternative headings as necessary to fit our user community. Once we have a working draft of headings and alternatives, we'll send out some user surveys, get campus feedback from the various groups I mentioned. We'll adjust based on our community feedback, and then we'll have, when we have final decisions on headings, we'll present them to the dean and associate deans. And once we have their approval, we'll begin working with our ILS group, our digital library, and special collections folks on the best way to implement the subject heading changes in each of those areas. So Rachel kind of talked about a few of the approaches, but we can't really say, again, at this stage, how we intend to do all of these changes. But that will, you know, that will come with time once we get through our initial steps. So next slide. I've compiled a selected list of resources and projects that are among those that we're reviewing. So there's 2 reports from the SAC working group, which is the Subject Analysis Committee. The first one is from 2016 on the LCSH illegal aliens. The second was just published last year on alternatives to the LCSH illegal aliens. Both very good discussion papers about that particular heading. The cataloging lab is kind of like a crowdsourced list of problematic headings, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. Excuse me. The OLA, it's the Oregon Library Association, their technical services roundtable created what they call a critical cataloging repository. And it's a really very detailed spreadsheet of problematic headings that could either be changed or have additional headings added to kind of help clarify what the thing is about. So they've got, I mean, it's a pretty long list of things, which is actually really quite impressive. The UC Boulder's library project, that's a link to their presentation slides about their project. The TRLN, so that's the Triangle Research Libraries Network, which consists of Duke University, North Carolina Central University, and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Those three libraries share a catalog and discovery layer. And so this is a link to their subject remapping program. OhioLink is a consortium of Ohio's college and university libraries and the State Library of Ohio, and that's kind of their report on headings. And then the last two are Orbis Cascade Alliance discussion papers. The Orbis Cascade Alliance are universities in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. So that's, I think they've just kind of limited their work to illegal aliens as well. But the first one, discussion paper, discusses about the topic, and then the recommendations obviously are in the second one. So these are just several of many more that we've compiled. We've done a lot of research kind of online to see who's published information about their projects. So if you're interested in, getting started, these are some really helpful ones to get started with. Okay, next slide. Cataloging Lab, as I mentioned, is a place where any cataloger can submit terms they deem offensive and provide possible alternatives. So like I said, it's kind of a crowdsourced list of problematic terms. And the link here on this slide will take you straight to their problem LCSH page. They've got a number of different resources, including links to like people's different library statements about harmful language. So there's other reasons that it might be useful to look at this, but they have their problem LCSH list set up pretty nicely where you can download the list in several different formats, which includes CSV, an Excel, or if you want it as like a PDF. And as of yesterday, there were 59 problem terms on the list. And we've put just a few examples from their list on here. So we've got invalids, with the suggested alternative of people with disabilities, Indians of North America with a suggestion of indigenous peoples of North America, and then slaves with the alternative enslaved persons. So this is another, well, I guess I mentioned it on the last page, but this is a really great start if you're looking for like a concrete list. This one and the Oregon Library Association list as well are good places to start if you want like actual terms and what people have suggested or chosen to implement in their catalog. So next slide. And these are some more examples of actual concrete terms or concrete changes. So from the projects that from a couple slides ago, these are ones that they that libraries have actually gone through. So illegal alien, people have added either a local term or an ERIC vocabulary term for undocumented immigrants. There was one library or a couple libraries that just opted to change it to immigrants, which is still an LCSH term. Aliens, people have changed that to a few different things. Non-citizens as a local term. Foreign nationals is from the ERIC vocabulary. And again, immigrants from LCSH. Alien detention centers has changed. I think UC Boulder changed this to immigrant detention centers, which they made a local term, made as a local term. The next two were recommendations actually by the African American Subject Funnel Project. So slaves being changed to enslaved persons, and these are actual terms currently in both MESH and ERIC vocabulary. And blacks to black people, either as a local term or an ERIC vocabulary. And then gender identity disorder, the Oregon Library Association recommended changing that their libraries change it to just gender identity, which is an LCSH as well. And then there's a lot of work around the names for indigenous peoples, and in changing, like rather than using kind of a blanket term in LCSH, changing those to the preferred names of those Indigenous peoples. For example, Ohio State University, they have the Meskwaki people in Iowa kind of get lost because they're classified under the LCSH heading for Fox Indians. And so one thing they're trying to tackle is how to get the Meskwaki people out kind of on their own heading. And then Rachel also mentioned the Wewa Library in Canada. They've just created their own controlled vocabulary for the Indigenous peoples or First Nations groups in Canada. So there's a lot of different things happening in relation to Indigenous peoples. Okay, next slide. So that kind of covers the information about our project, where we're looking and kind of where we want to go eventually. And so we wanted at this point to, I guess, get some feedback from you all, like as other libraries in the state, like what are you guys doing? Are you doing anything yet? Are you planning anything? We'd like to hear a little bit from you guys now.
Yeah, and I just shared that document again in case anybody joined later. I'm going to actually pop out and just kind of go over to that document. So in case anybody, no, it's empty, but feel free to add some things. I guess, are there any questions about anything that we presented on first that you'd want to ask before we move on to some of these broader discussion questions?
I have a question, if you don't mind.
Sure, John, go ahead.
Well, you were mentioning the LCSH problem terms as one of them being Indians of North America. And I know some people over at the Goshen Reservation here in Skull Valley. And I asked them what they would prefer to be called. And other than just calling them by their first name, they're good with being called Indians. Is that sort of a generational thing? Or I was wondering what sort of feedback you folk get, or what kind of feedback is part of the program to change these terms to better terms.
Well, I think that's a good point you bring up. I think there is a lot of division within communities about what they prefer to be termed. I think looking at, you know, the Navajo and Dene is another one. So that's a great question. And that's why we want feedback from our community and involvement from different groups on campus to represent those opinions. So we can make informed decisions, but that's a good point you bring up.
Right. These are people I'm talking to who are my age or older, so they're a little bit older, but I haven't had a chance to talk to the younger generation just to see what their opinion is. You know,
Right.
They might think of Indian as a pejorative, you know, but I haven't had a chance to talk to them.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's, you know, one of the reasons why we want to talk to our American Indian Cultural Center. I think I've already forgotten the name of it. Like, because they're in touch at least with the students on our campus, and you know, if that's something that they can advise on, we'll take whatever they would suggest, really.
Okay, right. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
It looks like Valerie's question, you may have said this while I was distracted away. What other established controlled vocabularies have made changes to better terms? Any, I think MESH has made some improvements, and this is just speaking broadly, and I don't really know much about specifics. MESH have made a few. I have noticed that there are some terms in LCSH that are being updated. But I think that's why a lot of people are starting fresh, since like long-term, like vocabularies that have been used for a long time are a little bit more difficult to kind of overhaul than just starting from scratch. And so I think that's why we find like homosaurus is something that's cropped up to use as an additional control vocabulary to LCSH, and why some people are choosing to make their own indigenous people terms. So I don't really have a better answer than that. So if someone else does, feel free to type it in chat. And then Bob has a good question. John makes a good point. Who gets to decide what is offensive or inappropriate? In some cases, it seems like common sense, but in others, is it the most vocal that prevail? I think that is a really good point. And it's hard to know because, even amongst, I think, individual communities, like we've said, people prefer different things. And so I don't know like what our user feedback will provide in terms of that. It might end up being like the most commonly preferred term is the one that we end up using. I don't really know without like having gone to that process. But I don't know. Rachel, do you have any thoughts?
Oh yeah, I'm like, well, I mean, yeah, I was just kind of thinking about for metadata. So I work with, non-marked metadata for digital collections, and our schema is a bit different than obviously the one, marked metadata and cataloging. We have, for our digital collections, we have a keywords field. And so oftentimes, like I'll do some research. Let's say if I'm working on a collection with indigenous people and put the preferred terms in a keywords field and then the LCSH term in the subjects field. So I have a representation of both. So I don't know if something like that, like including all the terms, is just going to make things more, convoluted and messy. I think this is when we really look to what's being done by the community of librarians and catalogers, and what the consensus of the most preferred term would be. But also we want to do some user groups with our community, our University of Utah communities to make sure that, we're doing things in a respectful way. Are there any examples of libraries who've created an all new vocabulary list and implemented it already in their catalog? I'm not sure.
I think the Wewa Library, and I'd have to look it up, but I think they have already implemented their vocabulary. So I'm trying to look over my other screen to see if I can find it.
Okay.
But I think that I believe that they have, or have at least started. So it might not be like completely implemented in their catalog. I'll see if I can find a link to their catalog, but Wewa, yeah, it's like
it's not spelled phonetic. Like I have, let's see, let me get
I'll put a link. So I've just put a link in chat for their
oh, thanks.
For the library, and they talk about the subject headings on there, but it's not an intuitive spelling.
I think that last comment to the IUG conference had a presentation where the online catalog terms were remapped, but the mark LCSH was not touched. I think that's kind of one of those solutions where on the front end it changes, but the back end it actually doesn't. But that requires some tech chops. So you'll need a tech department, a technology department to help.
Okay, a practical question. Everyone agrees that LCSH has its problems, but the advantage to large numbers of institutions using the same controlled vocabulary is the alternative. Is everyone coming up with their own solutions? First, this is a lot of effort, certainly, somewhat counter to the advantages of the copy cataloging principle. We don't all have to do things individually. We can use metadata others have created, and second, widespread use of a single controlled vocabulary makes searching predictable across wide swaths of databases, which is an advantage to our users that might outweigh everybody coming up with their own solutions. Yeah, and that's a really good point. And I think that I guess if Library of Congress was faster, SACO changes, or if more people like knew how to do it. I mean, we participate in NACO, BIBCO, and Concert, but we're not SACO members, so it's we're kind of not sure how to do some of these things. But yeah, if it was changed there and people were using it, it would be a lot easier. And what me personally, not speaking for the rest of our committee or whatever, I want to avoid doing a lot of local things if possible. So if there's terms in MESH, we already utilize MESH because of our Eccles Health Sciences Library. If there's ways that we can implement those existing vocabularies, I would prefer that certainly than trying to come up with local authority headings that we have to update. And then that begs the question, like, what if we buy something that's like was cataloged 30 years ago and it's still not going to have an updated term? Our copy cataloger would still accept that copy. So trying to figure out what an ongoing solution is for things, that are newly copy cataloged is another thing that we still need to kind of discuss as well. So I don't know if that answers your question or just kind of makes things worse for people, but that's, I guess, my personal thoughts. Any ideas on how to handle the importing of new authority records if you make local changes to your subject authorities? I think that kind of depends on what system you're on, really, and kind of gets into more of a technical approach. I think we, at the University of Utah, we're on Ex Libris's Alma and Primo, and they do have a way to import local authority records and to kind of use those. Like Alma kind of has some built-in authority control functionality that kind of takes care of some of the work for us. But I don't know really how other systems handle importing new authority records. So I don't have a good answer for that one, I'm sorry.
I think just a comment too on one of the questions about, the advantages of copy cataloging and the point of controlled vocabularies and using the same terminology across different systems. I think that the terms that we're pinpointing, like the list that we mentioned of 59 terms, obviously there's more than that, I'm sure, in the Library of Congress, but compared to the breadth of the subject headings found in the Library of Congress, I think that's still a pretty relatively small list. So I don't know how, if we make changes to 50 terms and not, I don't know, does anybody know how many subject headings there are in the Library of Congress? That it might be still a smaller kind of impact on the overall controlled vocabulary. So, and I'm seeing some comments come in. So it looks like some other people have considered a similar project, Salt Lake County, focusing on Utah Indian tribes, which we would love to do that too, especially speaking from digital collections perspective. I see that, I don't know the AF library, but you did receive some pushback from political groups. And I mean, I guess when we look at these terms, I would like to focus on who are they impacting and offending as the core audience to have an opinion on those terms. So I'm not sure, I mean, what we're trying to do is make our community feel more included, and those terms impact that community the most, and they should have the largest opinion, I think, on it. So. How to handle new imported records. So if the Library of Congress subject heading authority record has been added, has been locally updated. Any thoughts on that one? I lean to my cataloger cohort.
I think it comes down to, like, again, to this your ILS system and how it handles authority control. I would assume, well, I guess I can't assume anything because I don't know what every system does. So
yeah,
I'm not sure on that one. It might, you know, it might even need to be something that just gets manually done quickly, or if there's someone that's doing authority control at the library, maybe keeps an eye out for those types of things. I'm not sure. Because that's really not something that we've figured out either. So anyway, so I'm rambling now, but
yeah, and if you, I think our contact information is also in the presentation. If anybody who's considering a similar project wants to reach out to us and join forces at all, or I mean, feel free to do that as well. I think once we get to really getting some user feedback from our community groups, I think that will be a really impactful part of this whole process, right? So that we'd love to share, and hopefully May 2022 sounds like a long way away, but it's definitely coming up pretty soon. So as the way these weeks and months are flying by, so hopefully we'll have more to talk about, and we can report back at the full conference in May. Does anybody else have any thoughts or questions, concerns?
I have another thought, if you don't mind. It's anecdotal, but I'll throw it out for what it's worth. I have family members who are Mexican American, and the term Latinx is something that they don't like. They prefer to think of themselves as Latino or Latina. And they think of Latinx as somebody who is gay. And has that ever been a discussion or anything that has popped up as a discussion? I'm just curious to know what people are thinking out there.
I haven't heard about, I haven't heard any discussions about that term yet, so I don't know. So I don't know what people are saying about it. Like in terms of at least like the other inclusive subject headings, a lot of the focus I think is on general BIPOC, but not necessarily the Latinx as a term.
Okay.
So I'm not sure.
Well, this is family and they're very opinionated, so I just was curious.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I can guarantee you, yeah, we won't, with revised subject headings, I don't think it'll make everyone happy. That's for something you can count on. So, yeah, I don't know if we do. I mean, I definitely point to Nicole put together a really wonderful list of projects and resources, and I think this is a great place to start digging into some of the work that's been done, especially that Oregon Library Association. Basically, it's a huge Google document where you can see a list of a lot of the old headings, new headings, rationales for change. It's a really detailed, I'm so thankful that they actually shared this to the public, where you can kind of see, you know, a lot of the changes and the thoughts behind them and the rationale behind them. Oh, there's a question in the chat. about what do you think about the term Mormon, which is currently embedded throughout LCSH in irrelevant headings. It is currently at least discouraged by the community in question, if not considered offensive. This seems like it would be a big issue here in Utah. Yeah, definitely.
I think we'd consider changing that too. That's a really good point, Bob. Thank you for bringing that up.
Utah should lead that change.
Yeah. Yeah, and we do have a lot of, especially in our special collections, a lot of collections related, like BYU does, although maybe not quite as many, related to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So that's certainly another community that we, and another term that we would look at including in our changes.
I can just slowly scroll through the document just to kill time.
So another question, if you change all the terms to ones that many people are unfamiliar with, won't it inhibit searchability? I think that, yes, it could. But I think it relates to how we might decide to implement it. So if we were to do something like a local authority record, we could still include the older term, I guess, in that, and it would still be searchable within the catalog. And I think oftentimes, let's take illegal aliens, for example. Sometimes it's used in a summary note or in like a title. So in those instances, they definitely wouldn't. But the power of authority control is that if we make sure that alternatives are listed in an authority record, then no matter which of the terms a person searches, they should still be able to find the same resources, if that makes sense. So I guess it just depends on how well it's implemented, maybe. So is there an issue if the source of the new headings are all local? Perhaps just in terms of, I don't know, shareability, or like, because we, at the Marriott Library, we do a lot of our cataloging in WorldCat, in OCLC Connection. And so people can reuse our records. And if we're using a local heading that someone else isn't using, then that might be an issue, yes. But I think if we get it set up within our own system properly, using, authority control principles, then it shouldn't be an issue, I think. Does that kind of hit at your question, Angela? I don't know if that answers it or not. Okay, we do cataloging in TLC LS2. Yeah, if you do your cataloging with someone that doesn't use the term, then it might, create some extra work, certainly. Bob says, yes, you do need to think quite deeply about the searchability issue. Authority control is great, but is the authority file searched when patrons are searching in the discovery layer? Typically, authority files are unfortunately ignored in discovery layers. That's the case at BYU, at least. Is yours different? I think ours, from what I understand, our discovery layer is Primo, Ex Libris is Primo. And I believe that it does utilize authority records or authority files in the searching, but I haven't, to be honest, I can't say that I've, done a lot of specific search cases to see for sure. And I think once we start implementing some of these decisions and thinking about how to implement these changes, we're going to need to do a lot of testing in our discovery layer to see, exactly how well it works or not. Because really, I think we would be doing a disservice to not have, all of the terms searchable in the same way, and still pull up the same materials. So yeah, so that's definitely something that we need to look at when we're talking about how to implement and make sure that it does still work. We still have about 8 minutes left. If anyone has other questions, unless everyone's now like pining for lunch, we can, we're happy to wait to see if there's a few more questions or thoughts. We really appreciate the thoughts shared so far. I think all good things to consider when doing this. If you could choose, what term would each of you change first? Ooh. Since we have the time. I don't know. That's a really good question.
I think I don't know. I've always been, Indians of North America, I think, is changed to Indigenous peoples, but John brings up the point that he works with community members that prefer the term Indian. So
I mean, I think illegal alien, has gotten a lot of press, and so people are aware of it. So that might be. No, you're fine, Valerie.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm trying to think on my feet here. It's not
might
like,
might be a good place to start if we had to do one. Yeah.
I think a lot of the changes you can see is putting people in the term. So like, instead of like homeless, people experiencing homelessness, a lot of this is a push to humanize groups of people. And I think that's the most important message for me, at least.
Yeah, that's a good point, John. Maybe the terms that have come to the public conscience recently would be a good first step if you could only do a few. Any other comments or questions or anecdotes?
Yeah, I mean, have you ever experienced like seeing somebody offended by your metadata or cataloging? I have, and it doesn't feel good, so it's, you know, so to give a little bit of story, on my previous job, I had worked on digital collections for the National Park Service, and we had a large collection of Civilian Conservation Corps images in Kentucky, and specifically the African American Civilian Conservation Corps that were stationed in Mammoth Cave. And we were really excited, and we found this on Facebook. Essentially, you know, when the project went live, we wanted to see people actually using them. And somebody posted about the collection, and they were looking for their father and all of these pictures within the collection. But they were like, but they're using the term. They were very offended because the term Negroes was included in the original catalog and captions. And that was metadata that was probably created in 1940 that we didn't have the permission to change. So it was a really humbling experience to see like how we actually like hurt somebody, you know, that we wanted to use the collection. And a lot of that was just, you know, ignorance of not being sensitive, also not having the authority to change the original metadata in it. And that wasn't a subject heading, that was included in the original captions. So it's definitely an issue.
So Valerie says, my least favorite, though not controversial, is college teachers. I just want so much to write professors, definitely not on the urgency list. Yeah, that does seem a little unfair maybe to the work that they do. I think it is important for you to devise a method of doing this that is easy to do and satisfies the searchability problem and solves the problem of ingesting ongoing old metadata, no matter what term you choose. I suggest picking one or two just to run the process from start to finish to see how it could work or even if it's feasible. Yeah, that's a really great suggestion. Really good suggestion. Anything else?
Okay, well, if you don't mind my interjecting, it's almost at the top of the hour. So I just wanted to thank you, Nicole and Rachel, for the very interesting subject. I had no idea that all of this was going on in the background, and it's something that a lot of us, even if we're not touching catalogs directly, are things that we're working on. Just want to break and then thank you again for your presentation. And we'll go ahead and restart again at 1 o'clock. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thanks. And thanks, John, for hosting us.